In A Song of Ice and Fire, as in real life, there are cycles of violence. Countries, kingdoms, families, houses, individuals fall into the trap of blood debts, revenge, vendettas, vengeance. Sometimes you call it justice. The fact that there's so many words for it kind of helps sell the point a bit. There's so many ways to describe this concept, and it goes on and on. It tends to, as each fresh grievance must be answered. They never feel like it's quite equal. Like, now we've settled it. No, it always just kind of starts up again. Or maybe not always, but often it starts up again. Sometimes there's a resolution, but sometimes that's just a reprieve, not an actual end of the cycle. It's like dormant or hibernating. Without a third power to intervene, the end only comes when one side is ended, if they don't settle it on their own. But when they don't, that is often the only other way it gets settled. And often there is no third power to step in, no independent arbiter, no central authority to lay out what actually is justice rather than what passes for justice. But whether or not it has any sway, that sentiment always exists. There's always people, even those on the winning side, even on the side with the more just grievance, who hold true to the conviction that these cycles must end, that peace is more important than vengeance or anything, really. A Song of Ice and Fire, as in real life as well, has such individuals. As the Green Grace said, peace is the pearl beyond price. Now, she probably has a political agenda when she makes that statement, but that doesn't mean it isn't true. But Galaza Ellaria and her machinations, or lack thereof, are not the topic of today. It's another advocate for peace, someone who has seen the cycles up close and personal and is at risk of seeing even more. Ellaria Sand is our topic today. She's a mother of 4, one of whom is old enough to be joining the ongoing Game of Thrones just now, really, right where the story is. She doesn't want to see that daughter, nor the other 3 of her daughters, become part of that cycle of violence. But of course, she doesn't have full say over this. That makes for quite a contrast to her lover, the father of these 4 children, the infamous Red Viper, the man who perhaps most of all personifies these cycles of violence within a single character. You could argue Blackwood and Bracken personify it the most in terms of houses, but in terms of one single person, Oberyn Martell's brief time on screen is all about settling an old score, and his history has a lot to do with continuing other old scores. So he has a lot of experience with it on both sides, both the receiving end and the giving end. Additionally, Ellaria is a bastard of House Uller, known for being violent, a bit mad, and vindictive, and according to our last episode, hardcore. Yeah. Her father seems to be more than willing for Dorne to be thrown into war, either over the death of the Red Viper or perhaps just in general, because some people want war and he's an Uller. Some people do be like that. But she was even closer to the Red Viper than, well, perhaps anyone, even Doran or their beloved Elia, whom they named their first child together after. That's telling you something, isn't it? And despite that closeness and his loss, Ellaria openly argues for peace. She argues that the cycle should end. In fact, it is quite possibly because she is so close to all this bloodiness that she wants to stop it. But that's not all that makes her compelling. For the rest of what makes her interesting, well, we've got all that and more on this episode of History of Westeros podcast. I can't hear him.
What are you trying to tell me?
I can't hear him.
Oh, Sean, we can't hear you, Sean. You're muted. You need to tell Sean that.
I'm so sorry I was muted.
Tell me, I'm like, I don't tell me that.
So I was saying that another character like Oberyn that maybe does a lot to personify the concept of vengeance. Maybe she isn't old enough or hasn't gotten wrapped up in it enough yet, but Arya is on that path.
Yeah, that's true.
Thinking about it,
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Her list is very much that, and we hope that maybe she finds a better path in the long run. But in the short term, it's going to be pretty interesting. We'll see what she does. So yeah, Arya is a good example of the opposite end of that, I suppose, or maybe someone that will go through this cycle and decide she doesn't want to be a part of it anymore, which is something we'll suggest for Ellaria. Ellaria may not have been born, and as a teenager may not have been like this. She may have, in fact, become anti-vengeance because of the death of the Red Viper. That may have been what woke her up. That's a topic we will be getting into today, among others. But before we get into the episode, I want to recommend a podcast I've been listening to, and I think you'll enjoy as well. If you like Viking stuff, The History of Vikings, hosted by Noah Tetzner, is available wherever you get podcasts. It's a mostly interview-based podcast, so Noah gets experts, historians, archaeologists, writers, etc., people who know specific things, who have made it their career to understand these things as best as possible. And as I said, I've listened to the show quite a few times. I've binged it and kept up with it on a regular basis. Both cycles of that I've done. Some recent episodes include King Harold Bluetooth, Viking Age Ghosts and Zombies, Weapons and Battle Tactics, the Vikings in Russia, and most recently, in the end of 2023, an interview about Viking Yule, the Norse winter holiday, and the Wild Hunt, which is a fun mythological thing that's been used in a lot of different fantasy series and stories, especially The Witcher is the one I'm most familiar with. But anyway, yeah, subscribe to the History of Vikings wherever you listen to podcasts and let us know what you think. Hello and welcome, everybody. We're back with another episode. Glad to have you here. Almost every Sunday, we have live streams at 3 p.m. You can catch them afterwards, the edited version, anywhere you catch podcasts. The video version is well edited, put up on Spotify. And you can get everything available ad-free on Patreon. Sean, what are you drinking today? Some sort of mute juice? Is that... Mute juice is
I've got
for a podcaster.
Got the Naked Green Machine as always, and I've been adding the Bolt House vanilla protein in since the Naked protein drinks haven't been available, oddly enough. And I got a little Magic Mind in there.
Nice.
And good old Mountain Dew.
Magic Mind, not to be confused with Magic Mike. I'm going to keep making that joke for years. Yeah. And I want to make a special shout out here. Our good friend Nina, who normally we would shout out her blog here, which I'll do anyway, goodqueenalley.tumblr.com with one L in alley. But much more importantly than the weekly shout out, congrats to Nina and her new fiance James for getting engaged. Yay! Then there was much rejoicing.
I'd say that was her Jaehaerys, but we know Nina's not the biggest fan of Jaehaerys.
That's true. That's true. Yeah, that's a good point. Allie got her Jaehaerys, but not that Jaehaerys. We'll keep it more of a metaphorical
James
Jaehaerys.
Harrys.
Yeah, James Harrys. That's right. Yeah, his name is James K. And that's great. So yeah, James Harrys. That's right. Very good. Yes, congrats to y'all. We're very happy for y'all and wish you a happy life together. And yeah, 3 cheers from everyone. Rejoice. If you have any questions about anything we talk about today, or just how to support, where to find our social media, any of that, you can either email us at westeroshistory@gmail.com or visit historyofwesteros.com. It's all there, all the links, all the stuff, all the suggestions. And at the end of this episode, I'll mention some other ones that relate to things we discussed in this one. Before we get started, our usual trivia question. The answer can be found during the episode. Which house did Oberyn Martell foster at? The fostering system, of course, is very common with the nobles, and Oberyn was no different. He fostered somewhere, but where was it? I think we even mentioned it in last week's episode, hardcore houses, so you may have come in knowing that. But if not, like I said, it'll be repeated, so keep your ears peeled. Ellaria is not a warrior, nor does she have much political power. She may have had a little bit through Oberyn, but that's gone now. So most of our focus will be on her relationships with other characters, as well as what she means to the story, what she represents and all that, which is fairly unique. Doran points out how well he and Oberyn worked together, despite seeming to be so opposite in many ways. Some of that is because Doran's his brother. They have the blood ties, and they loved each other regardless of their differences and vice versa. But at the same time, you don't choose your siblings. You don't choose your parents. You don't choose your family. Ellaria and Oberyn must have had plenty of important things in common to have a functional relationship that lasted so long. I mean, this is a violent, aggressive man that had a stable relationship with this woman for 15 years or so. I mean, maybe even longer, but that's a long time. And they weren't forced to be together. This wasn't an arranged marriage like a lot of noble marriages are. So part of what makes her and them unique is this scenario. They chose each other. They loved each other. And they were the only person in each other's life that were ever like this. Neither of them had a comparative relationship that was similar. Well, she wouldn't have had time for one, and he never stayed with any of his other mothers of his children for more than a little while. Now, usually we do a first mention or first appearance section here, but hers we're going to place chronologically instead because we want to analyze that scene a lot. The one where she first appears, but only after we set it up. So let's talk about her birth and early life. Her father is Lord Harmon Uller. We don't know who his wife / her mother was, not surprisingly, nor do we know if they have other children. So the Uller family is a little bit hazy right now. He may not have any other children. His brother Ulwick Uller, it's kind of hard to say, showed up with the Red Viper and Harmon at the party when Oberyn showed up. So those three came together. Oberyn came with Ulwick, Harmon, and Ellaria, but there were no other Ullers. So if he had an adult son, he either stayed home to be. There must always be an Uller at the Hellhold or some business like that. So we're not quite clear on that, but it's notable perhaps that we might learn eventually. So this Harmon Uller is thus grandfather to the 4 children of Oberyn and Ellaria, who are Elia, Obella, Dorea, and Lareza, who will certainly have a few things to say about throughout this episode. Also important to mention, Sean, when we were starting this episode, did you recall or did it occur to you to consider that the Dornish tend to treat bastards differently? So there's already a bit of a dichotomy here with what we expect from a relationship with a bastard person of either gender.
Yeah, I was even thinking the idea of leaving a son at Hellholt. Well, it might not have been a son; it might have been another daughter or some other heiress. Even if we think of them as being hardcore, women can be hardcore.
Oh yeah, no doubt.
And we see it's kind of a theme here. Looking at Ellaria, how this difference of like a woman knowing her place, that concept is not part of her psyche or her culture or anything. So
right on. And of course, this extends to their relationships, like their paramours and non-traditional relationships like that. Just Dorne's more accepting of such things. So this is something that builds up as important for Ellaria. Is a lot of things that are relatively normal in Dorne are, culturally shocking to Westerosi nobles. Like, oh, she's a bastard. Oh, she's a paramour. Oh, she's Dornish and she's a woman. There's a lot of prejudice wrapped up in this character.
Yeah,
aimed at her by others, which is part of what makes her interesting. We don't know that she was raised by her father, but because of the way Dornish treat their bastards, she probably was. There's every reason to assume that based on what we know. She, in fact, rather not she, Arianne assumes that Lord Uller would be angry to hear that Ellaria and her daughters were imprisoned. If he didn't think much of his bastard daughter, he wouldn't be upset about this, I wouldn't think. So it all lines up pretty well to show that, yeah, she was probably raised there, given a relatively normal education for a Dornish noble person. And despite being an Uller, though, she, another thing we discussed about the Ullers, she doesn't seem to have the madness, if it's even really a thing. But maybe it's because she was raised in a vindictive, aggressive environment with all these blood feuds that maybe that's why she's on the opposite extreme. Opposite extreme.
Easy for you to say.
Yeah, she has a lot of upfront knowledge. She's up close and personal and has maybe most, if not all, of her life. So, I said, oh yeah, go ahead.
I can't remember if or how much we talked about that in the Hardcore Houses, but you can imagine Ullers might want to play up this notorious reputation of being mad. Like, let them think we're mad. We're actually pretty even keeled here. And again, even that is something that could change from generation to generation, depending on who's in charge or whether or not they're going through war and such. But I tend to think that she probably did have a shift after Oberyn died, but it could be that she was raised, and the Ullers in general are a little bit more level-headed than you might think. So.
Yeah, it's a good point. Yeah, definitely in an environment like Westeros or just in Dorne, there's definitely value in people being afraid of you, even if it's not deserved. So, yeah, like I said, not a warrior, nor is she a poisoner or a courtier or a political animal or an ambitious person. But in spite of that, or perhaps partly because of that, she stands out. We see her good education come up when she talks with Sansa about Baelor the Blessed. And this is the difference between naive and maybe someone who's been around the block a few times, like Ellaria, where Sansa's still very young in this moment. This is a Storm of Swords, where Sansa repeats the familiar legend that the Vipers refused to bite Baelor the Blessed because he was so holy. And Ellaria is like, no, he was bitten quite a few times. Like his feet were full of the holes. He's not holy. His feet were full of holes from where the Vipers bit him. And it's wild that he didn't die, which, to be fair, you would expect that if he had been bitten, he would have died. So it's kind of like, yeah, maybe he wasn't.
It's a miracle either way, right?
Yeah.
It's one way to look at it. Like, even when she tries to bring the truth of it to Sansa, I feel like she's still recognizing it's still impressive. You have a detail wrong, but it's still very impressive.
And and this is a neat point to make, Ellaria of all people talking about Baelor the Blessed, a person who was like overwhelmingly dedicated to peace, like perhaps more so than any character we could ever point to. Maybe not even perhaps, just I can't really think of someone who personifies peace more than Baelor the Blessed. Now, Ellaria, being educated and having a conversation, knows that too, and so does Sansa. So it's neat that George had that dialogue come from her, a person that becomes such an advocate for peace. Now, we don't know when she was born, but she has a 14-year-old, so that gives us some sort of range. Oberyn was born in 257 or 258. I'm going to guess that she's about 8 or 9 years younger than him, which would make her about 32. It could be less. I mean, she could be more like 34, 35. I'm assuming she's younger than him. Fairly safe assumption, but it doesn't have to be like a lot of a gap. Anyway, she seems to be intelligent and poised, examples of which we'll see, like emotionally tough, strong mental health, basically. Most of what we see of her is through Areo Hota's eyes, and Areo is a tough man, right? Strong himself, no doubt. And he notes how strong and good she is. And Doran notes how much Oberyn loved her. So the adults in the room all recognize this, and it's noted several times.
And these are all characters who we're meant to trust their perspective, for lack of a better way, right? We're not suspicious of their opinions of her. So.
Yeah, that's a very good point. Nina notes that as well, that Ellaria isn't afraid to look Cersei in the eye or speak to Sansa on equal terms, even though like some people would be like worried about the hierarchy there. And it's like, oh, Sansa's this heir. At the time, Sansa was still betrothed to Joffrey, or had just been dropped? No, that had been dropped. Yeah, that had been dropped at the end of Clash of Kings. So she's being, poached by the Tyrells and going to be married to Tyrion and all that. So she still ranks, quote unquote, way higher than Ellaria, but that didn't seem to matter to her. She wasn't intimidated. And I got to think that this is part of what was attractive to Oberyn in the first place, noting this woman's confidence and her just ability to be herself in these environments where there's a lot of pressure to be something she's not, just to look down on her.
It reminds me of something I kind of realized through the course of that Hardcore Houses episode. I think at the moment we were talking about cannibalism, but just the idea in general that part of what makes someone hardcore is it's something that would normally get in the way, doesn't get in the way of someone who's hardcore, whether that, for better or worse, right? Whether it's the cold or hunger or some social construct like not eating other humans, or in Ellaria's case, this idea of her social rank. She's like, I don't care about social ranks. That social rank's not going to hold me back. I am who I am, and I'm confident with it, and I'll speak to anyone as an equal. Like, that's kind of a hardcore mentality to have, right? To not let something that normally might hold Sansa or some other person might be timid in the presence of some lord, but not her. She's just as confident as ever. So.
Yep. Well said. Good said. Now, interestingly, this makes both of them slightly more interesting, not more interesting, but more unique, is that there's only one character named Oberyn in all of A Song of Ice and Fire and A Song of Ice and History. Surely there's others. We just they haven't been revealed. I doubt he's the first person ever named Oberyn in history, but he's the only one we know of. Same with Ellaria. There's no other Ellarias in Fire and Blood or The World of Ice and Fire or Dunk and Egg or Song of Ice and Fire. So they're both the only ones with that name for now. So let's touch on just how well Oberyn and Ellaria are written as a couple. He is perhaps the single most representative character of the blood feud concept. As I said in the intro, let's describe just why real quickly. Not only did he get his nickname, the Red Viper, from the Ironwood incident, which is when he slept with Lord Ironwood's paramour, got caught, and then there was a duel for honor. And since they were high ranking, it was just a duel to first blood, not to the death. But then the Ironwood got sick after the duel, and it was whispered that he used poison. The guy died. It was like, uh-oh. And then the Ironwoods and Martells have had a long running feud. So that really harmed it. And to fix that, that's why Quentin became squire to the Ironwoods, and a few other things had to be done to fix that relationship. And then he reignited the Tyrell Martell feud by hurting Willis Tyrell. That one probably wasn't his fault. I believe him when he says it was the boy was too young and he got his foot in the stirrup, and that all adds up to me. Maybe the Red Viper went hard on him anyway, but he's right that he shouldn't have been. Either way, it reignited a feud. It just goes to show these grudges. It doesn't take much. It publicly it looks bad, even if he didn't do it on purpose, and it's part of the problem with these things in the first place, right, Sean?
Yeah, sometimes when there's already this history, something that normally would be overlooked or excused instead becomes an excuse to reignite the past flames.
And that is exactly there. And of course, the big one, the one that he's after, the revenge on the Lannisters for Elia, which is most of his story. It's almost like the inverse of the concept of fridging, where you have often a woman character dies to give pathos to a male character. Well, he died and she's the one that has the pathos, but he was still maybe the more important character. I don't know. I mean, at the time he was. Maybe in the long run we'll see. But yeah, it's kind of an inverse of that concept. Anyway, he had 4 daughters with 4 different women, of course.
Him dying gave pathos to a nation.
Yeah,
the
whole country.
To everyone.
And she's the one that's like, no, I'm the one that's closest to him, and all of you are wrong.
Yeah, and I feel like often when a woman is fridged, it is the inverse, in that the man wants vengeance, and so it really is very inverted there.
Yeah, it's kind of neat, right? I was like, oh, I definitely didn't catch that until taking a look into this topic. Was like, yeah, it is kind of an inverse fridge, which it's also funny that it's Dorne, like the hottest country. So it's deserting. That's what we call this, right? Or baking, or it's fridging. This is ovening. Yeah. Sean?
Another thought, it's especially if he didn't poison that Ironwood character, then it would be 2 instances of him kind of being mixed up in the reignition of a blood feud that wasn't really his fault. But when it comes to Elia, he's like, now this is real, right? That he might be extra, like those other things should have, couldn't have happened or whatever, but this needs to happen. He might have an extra sort of vindication in his mind about this vengeance.
Yeah, that's true. Now, to be fair, sleeping with a High Lord's paramour is probably not probably a provocation. It's probably fair to call that a provocation.
Indeed, but you can still how he would think anyone can sleep with anyone. What's the big deal? Like you can see how he would justify that as something that's not worth, drawing blood over.
Yeah, but, which is part of why they tried to settle it with just a first blood duel but then that got worse because anyway. So he didn't seem to have much of a pattern, like a type. Oberyn, I mean, the 4 women he had children with before Ellaria were very different from one another. Obara's mother was a sex worker from Old Town, or in Old Town. We don't actually know if she was from there, but fairly safe assumption. Nymeria's mother was an aristocrat from Volantis, like very different there. Sorella's is a sailor from the Summer Islands, all really, really different too. And then Tyeen's was a septa, not exactly sure where she was from, but probably not from Dorne. So that's an example of just 4 women who, maybe they have some things in common, but it's not apparent to us just from hearing descriptions of them. We don't see them on screen, so it's hard to get detail.
They're all stacked.
They're all stacked.
They all got asses.
They're all baddies, yeah. Total baddies. So Nina says Ellaria also occupied a somewhat liminal space compared to the mothers of his older daughters. She wasn't any of those things. She's not a sex worker. She's not a foreign aristocrat, certainly not a sailor, certainly not a septa or any of these things. So just Dornish woman, an actual Dornish person. That's the other thing that's interesting about Ellaria compared to Oberyn's lovers is she's the first one that's Dornish, right? So that as well is, I don't know if that's anything we can read into that, but it's noteworthy, I suppose. And the fact this may have been part of what drew him to her in the first place, and vice versa. Well, maybe not vice versa. Scratch that. What drew Oberyn to Ellaria may have been in the fact that she didn't have all this baggage that so many noblewomen have, which is political considerations. If they have kids together, those kids will have political considerations. They might have claims that need to be addressed. But by making this bastard woman his lover, their children are connected to the royal family, but they're not a threat in that sense. They don't have the same political power that makes them dangerous. They are dangerous, the sand snakes are, but not for that reason.
Necessarily true. Like, do you think that there's no way that those bastards would ever have a claim on the hellhole through like conniving? Like, I feel like they could if they really wanted to.
Yeah, I shouldn't say no claim. It just significantly reduces
significantly
it.
less. But like the rest of the Ullers die. They're getting the hellhole.
Yeah.
And if they killed the rest of the Ullers, say, like, let's say little Elia was like, I want this. I think she could get it.
Yeah, you might be right about that. Yeah, like with the right maneuvering and proper levels of violence, you can do a lot. It's a good point. Yeah.
I wondered for a moment if that might be part of why I don't know about the physical attraction, could be a million different things, but there's a million women for him to be physically attracted to. But to start this relationship with a Dornish woman, I wonder if there was some amount of maturing in him thinking about his perception as the prince with women from all these other lands. Maybe he needs to bring it home a little. Maybe Doran told him to do that. And even if that was the case, the relationship they end up forming after the fact seems strong. But yeah, I wonder if there was an amount of him deciding to settle down with someone from home for the sake of looks,
It's possible. And the timing of their apparent meeting is very important as well, which we're about to get to. One or two more points before that. How Ellaria and Oberyn met, we don't know. He was fostered at Sandstone, which is one castle over from the Hellholt. So, but I wouldn't call it close. Maybe they met at a tourney or a wedding. There's lots of just high-end functions that they both could have been at. Nina has a great theory, though, which is that recall that Oberyn was probably overseas during Robert's Rebellion because he just isn't around. There's no note of where he was, so he's probably overseas. And we hear that he briefly tried to raise Dorne for Viserys, Dany's brother, at some point after the war was over, probably after he returned home from overseas. Now, that was put down. They were like, no, stop, no, cut that. So he didn't get very far with that.
Intervention.
Yeah, all the things. Just don't do that. Yeah. And he may have gone around to various castles in Dorne to try to see their reaction, to be like, hey, would you join me in this? Let's go. So in order to raise Dorne, he's got to go talk to lords. Like, we know he was trying to quote raise Dorne, which means he's going to try to fire them up, which probably means talking to them in person. So if he had gone to the Hellhole at that point, there you go. He meets Ellaria on this mini tour of important Dornish castles trying to get something going. So, and in fact, maybe that's part of what slowed him down. He's like, actually, I would rather hang out with this woman than what was that? Why was I going to war in the first place? Yeah, they clearly have a lot of chemistry, but not just romantic, but sexually. Oberyn flaunts their bisexuality, the threesomes they have, and all that. And he might be exaggerating a little bit, but I have no real reason to doubt him. It's not like it's a political advantage for him to point that out. So it just seems like a thing that's his reputation, and he talks about. Yeah, why not? But it's not unbelievable at all. But yeah, there is a reason. Okay, go ahead.
This is very speculative, but my theory before that he might have, for the sake of perception, felt like he needed to marry or pair with a Dornish woman. When he's going around trying to get lords on his side to raise up, which he might be fired up to fight. If he was overseas fighting for some mercenary company and comes back home and he's just like ready to go to battle, like, hey, let's get a battle. Let's go fight for. But when he goes to talk to the different lords, like, man, you haven't even been home. you've got kids with women from all around the world. You're not really a Dornish prince. You might have faced a little bit of that, and he might have felt it would give him more legitimacy to have a Dornish woman be the mother of his children.
And if we keep in mind the whole plot line, the focus of his plot line, which is revenge for Elia, of course, that's most front and center in his mind here, returning from overseas to find out that his beloved sister, the one that he was quote unquote inseparable from, that's his main reasoning here. So picture this, he's still in grief, but his grief mostly manifests as anger. He wants to get revenge. He wants to get back at the Lannisters in particular, and mostly Tywin, but would happily take his vengeance on other Lannisters. So I'd guess their relationship began shortly after his return to Westeros. It wouldn't likely have started before, since he was overseas or during, right? So Elia was born not long after the death of Elia's sister, Ellaria Sand, was born not long after, maybe only 2 to 3 years. So that also fits as a very likely time that their relationship began. And maybe Ellaria encouraged the name Elia for their first child to help set her ghost to rest, to calm his need for vengeance a bit. It didn't seem to work, but hey, it's worth a try. And that may have been partly what kept them together. You have this connection. You have a child that you've named after your sister like that, someone that you loved and were super close, the person that he was most close to in this world. And then Ellaria took the place of that, became the person he was closest to in this world until they were separated by his death. So he treated her as basically like a wife. He treated her with respect and regard, not in the way that you would maybe have expected, given the way he treated like Obara's mother, for example, or just how he treated people in general. Like, he isn't someone that treats people very well in his early life, and maybe not so much in his later life either, but there seems to be some exceptions. And Ellaria is probably number one on that list. She can't replace Elia, but she was the loving relationship that he had never had with someone that wasn't, I don't mean to suggest, even though there is that joke in the book where he's like, yeah, we're as close. I was as close to her as Jaime and Cersei. And Tyrion's like, well, I hope not. And his mind's like, yeah. And it's like, some people take that as evidence, like George tongue-in-cheek saying that they were that close, that they were an incest couple, which, it's possible, but there's really nothing to indicate that besides this one sideways comment there. So I don't think so. Anyway, the point is, going from this traumatizing loss to wanting to start a war to finding the perfect woman for him and naming their first child after that lost sister is all pretty moving and comes in a short period of time, relatively speaking. So it really seems strong as something to work as headcanon, I think. Nina compares Ellaria to Jane Westerling. Rob emphasizes to Catelyn that he fell for Jane in part because it came during a time of deep devastation. He had just been wounded. He just found out that Winterfell was lost and Bran and Rickon were killed, which of course they weren't, but that's what he thought. And Sansa marrying Tyrion had come not long before that. So it was just blow after blow after blow. In addition to actually being physically wounded, which isn't going to help. You have an infection in your shoulder and all that. It's going to make everything feel even worse. So that is part of what started their relationship. And once it started, it had that rooting in that beginning, which was so emotional. It's always going to be a part of their it was always a part of their relationship, and it'll be with Jane until she dies. And it'll be with Ellaria until she dies. There's never going to be a replication of those unique circumstances where he really needed someone, and then it became the perfect person for the rest of his life. So I wonder how often they talked about it. Like, did they talk about Elia? I would guess so. Like, you tend to talk about these things with your partner, and of course it was on his mind constantly. It was like his life's work almost to achieve justice for Elia. So I'm sure it came up in their conversations. But it doesn't necessarily mean he discussed his specific plans, like, oh, I'm going to put poison on my spear and I'm going to become Tyrion's champion. I don't know that she knew those things, but we'll get to that when we get to that part of the story. It's an interesting question, though, whether or not she, how close were, like, some men keep their dirty secrets away from their families or their wife, but some are, it's just as much their secret. It's it depends on the couple and the family.
That might have been part of their bond, or why she was so special and important to him. You're wondering if he talked to her about Elia. She might be the only person he talked to about Elia. To everyone else, he's this badass warrior and he wants revenge and he's got the spear and may talk poison, whatever else, but he doesn't reveal these inner sadnesses or whatever that he has, but he does to her, and that might been the thing that really bonded them.
Yeah, I mean, I assume he talked about it with Doran, but not like necessarily in a way that was deeply engaging and like they didn't cry together. It's hard to picture princes of Dorne doing that the way their culture is. It probably would have been therapeutic for them, but I don't really guess that they did. But with her, he could let his guard down maybe and be a little more vulnerable. Something tells me he was still pretty rigid about it, but less so. He still might have had his moments where he let some genuine emotion out, and that wasn't anger. Not that anger isn't genuine, it's very genuine, but you see what I'm saying, that he might have been softer about it in some moments behind closed doors. And Dorne does have the social hierarchy, even though it's different than the rest of Westeros. They still have, let's not fool ourselves. They still have haves and have-nots. They still have elites and people in poverty, just because their noble system is a little different from Westeros. Maybe it's a little closer to something we like. It's still pretty bad. It still, prioritizes the people at the top. The aristocrats can still get away with things. Quentin thinks that the Drinkwater twins were too lowborn for him, for example, and Quentin's a pretty good kid, but this isn't, it's an uncomfortable thought, but he's not thinking that they're, in terms of his ego, he's not saying, oh, I'm too good for them. He's just acknowledging the way these things work, and their rank is beneath a prince, and it's just a fact in his mind. It's like a judgment call where he's like, no, this Drinkwater's no. He doesn't have that thought. It's like a matter of fact thing.
Maybe similar, if we're thinking about why maybe Oberyn and Ellaria didn't get married, like he might still be attracted to those twins and maybe could have a relationship or even have kids with them, but he can't marry them. They're too lowborn for that,
And that is the big question. Why didn't they marry? Why didn't they? There's a lot of reasons, though. There's one right there. We mentioned a few others, which is just he gets to keep them out of politics, or at least not out. As Ashea pointed out accurately, it doesn't keep them out of it. Clearly, the Sand Snakes are involved. But it enables them to keep more of a distance if they so choose, and gives them a little more protection against being embroiled in schemes. Take Sorella, for example. Sorella's off doing her own thing, and she's just left alone. They're like, yeah, let her do what she wants. She's not here. We can't mess with her, and we don't really want to, because she's not really being a problem. And keeping his hand open. Think about John Connington and the value of having the option to marry someone. He's like, oh, as long as his hand is available, as long as he's unmarried, it's something you can offer in a negotiation or to offer to an ally. So having that ability, even if you never intend to use it, just showing that you can do it has some value. Just similar to the concept of showing that making people afraid of you, right? Even though you aren't necessarily that scary, using that to your advantage. It's like, well, if you're not married, well, let's use that to our advantage and say, we could float that around and get people interested, get people coming at us to make offers and keep them in our corner that way, just short leash kind of thing.
Depending on the position you get into, you keep it available for other people to come to you with that proposal too. It's like not only is it a tool for you, but it's a tool for others to come to you. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So yeah, that's a good point. Yeah.
You eliminate a tool for yourself and other potential allies once you have been married.
And a lot of times,
unless you're Targaryen, you just get married again.
Yeah, right. Or think about what Tywin did. Tywin was not willing to entertain any marriages for Cersei until the Rhaegar option was completely off the table. He's like, okay, now I got to do something else, because I wanted the prince, and the heir to the throne. I couldn't get that, but he wasn't willing to settle for anything less than that. So yeah, Doran may have believed that having Oberyn available that gave them an option that would cause their enemies and their allies to treat them a little differently, or at least to factor that in. So there's also no need for him to marry. Like obviously Doran has 2 sons and a daughter that came before both of them. So 3 heirs. And since Dorne women can inherit, you don't have to wait for a son. There's a kid. It doesn't matter what their gender is. As long as, whoever's firstborn goes. That's that. So, and Ellaria might not have cared. She might not have wanted to get all that embroiled. She might not have wanted to get that deep into it. She may have preferred to keep things at arm's length. And she certainly wasn't raised to expect to marry a big name. That wasn't, like Sansa was, or like Cersei was, right? They expected it. Ellaria never would have expected that.
I just want to point out the humor there. It's a step in the right direction to let any child inherit, and it doesn't have to be the oldest son. But there's still a little humor to like, well, there's a kid. Any kid will do. Like,
yeah,
it shouldn't be a kid. Like, it should be inheritance in the first place. If it is gonna be, at least women should be allowed to do it. But Jesus,
yeah. So again, lots of reasons there, and we don't know which one it is, but it's not strange, even though we don't know the reasons, because there are so many available reasons that it could be, and it might be several of those reasons. She becomes a bit of a peaceful weapon. That's what I've called this next section, because it's like the concept of Aikido. The martial art Aikido is built around using your enemy's weaknesses against them. They try to punch you, and you move out of the way, and they punch the wall, or they get over balance reaching for you, and then it's just that you can slightly push them and then they fall over, right? It's using their weaknesses against them, or using their anger against them. In this case, their momentum against them. Yeah. In this case, nobles are so just uppity and snooty about bastards, it gave the Dornish an opportunity to rub their faces in it and say, haha, you have this weakness and we're going to exploit that. If you're deeply offended or made uncomfortable by something, your enemies will take note of that and use it. It was like, let's make them deeply uncomfortable. And so they did that by bringing Ellaria Sand. Let's look at the brilliant scene, which is Ellaria's first appearance, which comes a few paragraphs after Oberyn's first appearance. Quote,
"He raised a slender hand toward a black-haired woman to the rear, beckoning her forward. And this is Ellaria Sand, mine own paramour." Tyrion swallowed a groan. His paramour and bastard born. Cersei will pitch a holy fit if he wants her at the wedding. If she consigned the woman to some dark corner below the salt, his sister would risk the Red Viper's wrath. Seat her beside him at the high table, and every other lady on the dais was like to take offense. Did Prince Doran mean to provoke a quarrel?
Yes. The answer is yes. There's zero chance they didn't realize that they would have this reaction. They're like, oh, they're going to be so up, like what? They're going to be so discomfited and so thrown off. Like Tyrion swallowed a groan. He's like, they're going to swallow groans. Yeah, this is exactly what's going to happen. They saw it coming a mile away. Cause a distraction, cause discomfort, anything, whatever. It's just all the tropes and expectations of Dornishmen. Oberyn is doubling down on his public display. He's like, they're going to expect the Dornish culture to make them uncomfortable. We're going to go full Dornish and just really throw it in their faces and see
they're
what
going to
happens.
have to deal with us. They're going to have to deal with us in ways that they don't like. Right off the bat. Yeah.
Like Tyrion was expecting Doran. Like, wait, there's no litter. And I'm like, uh-oh. And it's like, yeah, you've got me to deal with. But it's not just me. It's my paramour who's going to cause problems, not directly. She's not going to do anything. But just being there is going to piss off a lot of people, And he presses and Oberyn backfoots them immediately. You can see how planned this is, because he, rather than being like, oh, I'm sorry to be causing this disturbance, he goes on the offensive, presses the issue by pointing out how more distinguished his group is, despite containing this bastard paramour. He brought a bunch of lords with him, whereas Tyrion did not. And Oberyn makes a show of it right here. Quote,
Prince Oberyn wheeled his horse about to face his fellow Dornishmen. Ellaria, lords and ladies, sirs, see how well King Joffrey loves us. His grace has been so kind as to send his own uncle Imp to bring us to his court.
The Imp is not a friendly nickname. That's not like his accepted nickname. That is an insulting nickname that people get away with calling to him because, well, it's court. You're supposed to not react to things like that. Tyrion does a few times react to it because he loses his temper, but this time he knows ahead of time to be on his best behavior, and he's like choking it all back.
Tyrion also can't challenge someone to a duel, and his father and the sister aren't going to back him up either, so it is
it's bad. Yeah.
So unfair for him as he moves through life to have to deal with that. But
yeah, I agree. And Oberyn knows this. He knows he can get away with it, not just because Tyrion has these things that he has to worry about, but Oberyn himself is a prince. And he's like, well, I'm a prince. I outrank everyone here, and I will say what I want, and I will get away with it. But he's also making sure everyone understands what's happening. He's making a public display. He's like, look who they sent. Look how much they respect us, So he's like I said, backfooting them, putting them on the defensive while he's thrusting on them what he knows is going to make them uncomfortable regarding his paramour.
And as you said, they thought Doran was coming, which means it should have been an even more regal reception.
Yes.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
So maybe if they knew it was Oberyn, they can get away without the king himself or a certain presence of royalty. But they didn't know it was Oberyn. They thought it was Doran, and yet still this was the reception. So it's even worse.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Good said. So next that comes off in the scene, Tyrion rattles off all the names, which we don't need to go through, but then he thinks to himself, quote,
"The names had a nice ringing sound as Tyrion reeled them off, but the bearers were nowise near as distinguished nor formidable a company as those who accompanied Prince Oberyn, as both of them knew full well."
Yeah, it was unspoken but obvious between them both. And so, again, it's pretty hard not to see this as extremely intentional on their part. Doran and Oberyn knew exactly what they were doing. They had a meeting about it. They're like, all right, this is what we're going to do. This is probably what's going to... And if they don't send out a big enough welcoming party, I'm going to do this or something like that. They may have planned it in great detail. And so they played right into the Martell hands by being petty. Like the Martells were maybe almost hoping for this, to give them more excuse to push the envelope, to use diplomacy as a weapon. Say, look, you guys weren't diplomatic. We're going to hold that against you, in addition to their existing grievances, which are quite a bit larger, but still. So you're right, Sean. If they had sent a larger party, like a more distinguished party, Oberyn it would have been harder for him to complain. He wouldn't have been able to grandstand the way he did, or maybe he would have found something to say, but it wouldn't have had the weight that this did. So
on some level, if they had sent a more distinguished party, Oberyn is it's seemingly hell-bent on revenge. It might not have worked, but on some level, that's the respect they're looking for, right?
Yeah.
It's sort of like a win-win. Should be sort of a win-win. If they don't send a respectable party, we get to throw it in their face. If they do, oh, well, that's what we wanted in the first place. Good start, But it was not a good start.
No, it was not a good start. So if Doran and Oberyn talked about all this, which again, I very much assume they did, how much was Ellaria included in this discussion? I assume maybe indirectly, maybe not in the same room with them. Maybe Oberyn fills her in afterwards, but maybe directly. Okay, here's what's going to happen. They're going to be off-put by your presence. They're going to call you bastard. They're going to snigger. They're going to give you dirty looks. Are you prepared for this? Are you ready to be treated like that? I assume it wasn't just they threw her into it and expected her to just swim without any training. And I assume they expected she'd be good at it because of her. They've known her a long time. Oberyn has been with her for 14 years at this point. He knows her worth and she knows his. So I think she was in on it, pretty aware of everything. And if not, she's smart enough to understand it. But I assume she knew. They told her. That way she could play it up. She can make it even more so.
If they didn't include her, I think it would have been because they didn't need to. They knew how she would behave, and it's what they wanted in the first place.
Yeah, like if she's gonna, go ahead.
That doesn't mean they couldn't still have included her.
Right. Like if she's gonna be visibly uncomfortable, it's not gonna work as well. They don't want this isn't gonna have the effect. They want her being proud. They want her not to be looking ashamed, because that throws them off even more. Like, she should be ashamed to be amongst us. She's so lower ranking. But the more confident she is amongst people that she's supposedly lower than, the worse it makes them look. And I think they knew that would happen too. So it's like, yeah, this is perfect. So if she was the kind of person that couldn't handle that, the kind of person that might just run crying from the hall because she can't handle the social pressure, well, they wouldn't put her in that position in the first place, because it wouldn't not necessarily be nice, although that would be part of it, but because it wouldn't work. It wouldn't show up the Lannisters and the others the way they want. They want to throw this in their faces, and that's not going to work if Ellaria just can't take the heat. But clearly she can. Either she can take it, or maybe even better, it genuinely doesn't bother her. That's entirely possible, that she's just so above it that she's like, yeah, throw me in there. I'm ready to make fools of these suckers. I'm ready to bring these folks down a peg. She might relish it. You never know. So she might have stayed for a while at court too. This is a great point by Nina. The intent was for him to be there. He was supposed to take the small council seat offered to Doran. It was going to be his instead, which in turn is now being offered to, wait, which one? Nymeria or Tyene? I forget which of them is getting it, but it's still being passed down to another Martell family member. So that's important, because Oberyn would have stayed in King's Landing for quite a while, given the original arrangement, if he hadn't been killed in the duel, which means Ellaria would have too. So this thing would have been a long-term thing of them constantly poking at people with her presence and being able to use their snobbishness against them. That would have been a long-term plan had things not gone the way they did. So, and also she could have maybe talked to some people and navigated certain social situations that a regular noble couldn't have, go places and talk to certain people. Like these problems cut both ways. Like, I can't be seen talking to this certain person. I'm the lady of whatever house, like it would be unseemly for me to be, but not for Ellaria Sand. So she might have a little more, let's say, roaming space to do things. That might have been the plan. Who knows? Either way, it reminds us of why, it gives us a good insight into why Oberyn was attracted to her in the first place. She has all this confidence and poise, and she's not intimidated by being the face of a giant trolling expedition against House Lannister. Like it's a pretty intimidating thing to do, but she seemed to just, I'm all for it.
This is probably too tangential to get into very deep, but I wonder how that might have played out given the actions of the High Sparrow when he's arresting Cersei and Marjorie for their, moral indiscretions or whatever. Would Oberyn or Ellaria have been arrested too? It might have been even more complicated and
it's true,
probably eventually violent.
It's a very good point. Yeah, that would have been oil and water mixing right there.
Yeah.
Compare Ellaria to our good friend Jon Snow. It was easy enough for the Starks to seat Jon in the rear of the hall during his very first chapter, during the feast for the royal family at Winterfell. The same Lannisters and Baratheons in this case, they can't separate the prince from his partner. That's just, you can't really do that. Like, no, your partner's going to sit over here and you sit here. It's weird. But Jon Snow, they just stick him in the back. Who cares? No, like, only like, as far as Catelyn's concerned, who cares, right? and Ned's not going to complain about that. And even Jon himself, he was a little bothered by it, but he took it in stride pretty well. Remember, he got drunk, which he said, "Oh, I wouldn't be able to get drunk if I was up there," but he was miffed for sure. Or think of Sansa masquerading as Elaine Stone. She couldn't sit at the dais while in disguise because it wouldn't be seemly as Littlefinger's bastard daughter. But if she were truly open as Sansa Stark, then that would be the obvious place for her. So we see this sort of example in multiple places. I think it's pretty well attested to. And these rules, right? These unspoken, unwritten rules. Well, they're spoken. Unwritten rules. They're very much spoken, but sometimes they're spoken very bluntly. So it's neat that in both cases, Cersei is at the center of concerns here, the one who is they're most worried about offending, or most excited about offending in the case of Ellaria. With Jon, they're like, oh, we don't want to offend her. With Ellaria, like, yeah, let's offend her. So, of course, Cersei is not the only outspoken person at court. Quote.
He had settled Prince Oberyn and his lords in a corner fort facing the city, as far from the Tyrells as he could put them without evicting them from the Red Keep entirely. It was not nearly far enough. Already there had been a brawl in a flea-bottom pot shop that left one Tyrell man-at-arms dead and 2 of Lord Gargolin scalded, and an ugly confrontation in the yard when Mace Tyrell's wizened little mother called Ellaria Sand the serpent's whore.
I mean, damn, right? Like that's I mean, we know Olenna talks a lot and she says what's on her mind, but that's even for her, that seems pretty blunt and nasty. So, and she's saying that to diminish her because, of course, in Westeros, a sex worker is at the bottom of the social ladder. So she's trying to compare her to that and say that's where you belong. That's how you appear in this company as someone who doesn't belong. So she's trying to emphasize and exaggerate that by saying that.
She also probably is doing a little bit of win in Rome, do as Romans do. She's got to seem like she's on Cersei's side if she wants to get what she wants out of Cersei.
That's a good point. That's a good point. I think she probably feels it somewhat earnestly as well, though, because she doesn't like the Tyrell. I mean, she doesn't like the Dornishmen. She's an old school reachman, a reach woman, and doesn't like the Martells. Doesn't like what Oberyn did to Willis, even though she maybe was aware that it wasn't on purpose, because she also makes a comment about Willis going into jousting too soon. So it was an actual agreement with Oberyn, but it was sort of like you could take it as tacit, like, yeah, Mace was a fool for putting him into jousting too soon. He wasn't that kind of boy in the first place. He wasn't Loras. Loras, go ahead. He's that talented, but Willis isn't that kind of kid.
So in certain companies, she might make that admission, but she knows the party line, if you will. We don't like the Martells because of what Oberyn did. That's the public stance she's going to take.
Yeah. And she might be trying to provoke a reaction too. And she knows that the Tyrells have like a full army at court, whereas the Martells brought like 300 men. So it's not, I mean, Tyrion points that out too. And Oberyn is not bothered by it, but it's not irrelevant.
She probably also knows that Oberyn's really there for Tywin and Gregor, right?
Yeah.
That's what she's really there for.
Mm-hmm.
And so if she can get him riled up, right? Even if he's mad at her, that anger will still be diverted to the Lannisters, which is good for her.
Yeah.
Like almost every angle, whether it was personal or calculated, it was a good play for her to say that in a way that it would get back to them.
And she recognizes that she's smart enough to know that they're making a provocation. So she's like, well, I'm going to provoke them right back. We two can play at this game. She's obviously on top of the subtleties of diplomacy. And even though she's not very subtle herself, she understands it quite well. So this provides us such a window into different forms of prejudice. This section is called A Window to Prejudice. Ellaria's time at court reveals a lot of how mainstream Westerosi look down on Dornish. Like specifically, we know that they have these prejudices, but it really comes out with her because they're against women, they're against bastards, they're against Dornish women. So it's a triple threat here. This quote from Sansa was absolutely full of that sort of learned prejudice and other revealing things. For example, quote,
Shay had told her that this Ellaria worshipped some Lycene love goddess. She was almost a whore when he found her, milady, her maid confided, and now she's near a princess. Sansa had never been this close to the Dornish woman before. She's not truly beautiful, she thought, but something about her draws the eye.
Now that is a very telling sentence from Sansa, isn't it? Is that like, well, I've been taught what beautiful is, but I think she's attractive. So she's kind of at odds with what she's been taught traditional beauty is, like standard Westerosi beauty standards, which is not the same as Dornish beauty standards. So she's still kind of like, yet I still like, so she's wrestling with that, I think, internally. And that's kind of interesting. So you have several different opinions here. You have Sansa's opinion, you have Shay's opinion, and you have what both of them have been taught, and they've been taught very differently because they come from extreme opposite ends of society. We just talked about how sex workers are at the bottom, Sansa's near the top, right? And so you have a conversation between these two types of people, which is a rare thing. And you see this, it's gossip in a nutshell here. Well, no, it is gossip. And you have to remember why Shay's even there in the first place. She's been hidden as a maid, right? She's masquerading as one of the maids because Tyrion's trying to keep her, was afraid of keeping her in the manse and all that. So anyway, Shay is not as young as Sansa. It's important to keep in mind that she is very young, though. They're probably both teenagers. Shay might be like 20, but I think she's 18 when we first meet her. So I don't think it's been a full 2 years till we get to this scene. Now Shay it's very interesting that Shay is disparaging Ellaria's social status by saying she was almost a whore, given that was Shay's profession. And even more ironic because this is what Shay wanted from Tyrion. She's like, I wanted to be almost a princess that was brought up from being a sex worker. She asked Tyrion, she's like, I could be your lady. I don't have to marry you, but you could give me jewels and all this other stuff. And I could be by your side. Like, she wants that. So she's projecting a little bit here that Ellaria got the thing that she wanted. I think there's a little of that, a little bit of jealousy here, but she's just wrong. Ellaria was probably not ever almost a whore. Like, that doesn't, we just went through talking about earlier how her father almost certainly raised her. And yeah, so there's no almost there at all. That's just pure gossip, I think. Or maybe it's because of things like what Olenna said. Maybe it came from that, like the telephone game. Mm-hmm. She calls her the serpent's whore. Someone else just repeats it a little differently. By the time 10 people have repeated, it's just, yeah, she was a sex worker in Dorne, and
not just Olenna, but Cersei and every other lady would all want to denigrate Ellaria. Yeah. And Shay is getting that perception, and maybe herself wants to denigrate her, right? Because she doesn't want to think that she did better than me, So
yeah, and as well, Oberyn's first child was with a sex worker, so maybe like people are mashing up the different stories about him and conflating, like that's who he likes or something. That's who he goes after is sex workers. I don't know. Yeah, so there's all these stories about him that will leak into what people will think about her because he's the big prominent figure. So it's very sad for Shay that she's projecting like this, and her upbringing was terrible. I mean, she was beaten and raped by her own father, whereas there's no indication Ellaria had any of that. So it's understandable that Shay has this because she's traumatized, and she would want to rise higher in this world no matter what. And to be so close to that and not get it is probably pretty torturous, especially given what ends up happening to her later. Ellaria didn't necessarily have a lot of career options, but she didn't have, she wasn't at risk of being like in the gutter like Shay was.
That is another thing too. Probably in, I don't know, mainland Westeros, most bastard-born girls are probably destined to be sex workers. It might be a semi-safe assumption that she was if they don't understand the difference in Dornish culture,
Yeah, maybe. Now, we know that that's pretty rare for noble bastard girls to have that be their only option, because there's plenty of, they often get married to knights or people of still very high social status, but not as high as a true-born child would get from a noble family.
Like if Shay only knows that her name is Ellaria Sand, she might not know that she's from the Oler house. So
yes, absolutely, you're right. And again, like you said, there's all this confusion and prejudice about Dornish bastards versus other regional bastards. So Sansa almost certainly had an even better education than Ellaria, but not by as wide a margin as Ellaria had over Shay. Shay's education was almost non-existent. Shay's education was all, in the streets, like learning by being out there and interacting with people. Like, she wasn't in classrooms or didn't have teachers, etc. So it's very.
You could argue that Shay knows more about the world than Sansa.
In some ways, she definitely
know more about history or elite politics, but Shay probably knows more about how to make it through the world as a normal human.
Especially at this point, because Sansa's biggest moments of growth seem to come after she gets away. She starts to have, she has some pretty big ones, but most of her growth really starts when she gets away from the Red Keep. Even though she's still under Littlefinger's thumb, she has more room to be herself and learn and think and reflect on the Red Keep and things that happened before, and maybe do some things a little differently. The Lysine love goddess thing is another bit of just prejudice-ish type thing here. Presumably Shay was gossiping with other maids, and that's how the news of what's in her chambers comes out. Like, they're going to go clean her chambers. That's not where Shay would be, because Shay is assigned to lawless Stokeworth, right? So nothing to do with these Dornish guests. But again, all the servants probably talk to each other, and they would talk about something in her chambers they found that would indicate she worships some Lysine love goddess. Now, they could have gotten that wrong, though. There's nothing to corroborate the story. You don't see anything of it later, but there's nothing. It's not like a negative thing. There's nothing to, I don't doubt it. question whether they got the details right. Maybe it wasn't Lysine. Maybe it's not love goddess. What type of love are we talking about here? All forms of love, or is it like a sex goddess, or like a romantic love goddess, or familial love for your children or your family? Like, there's lots of types of love, y'all. So
I'm kind of just picturing that Ellaria had some kind of horny statue in her
maybe
room.
she's had a
like...
dildo, and they're like, "That's a Lysine love goddess."
That's hilarious.
They've never seen one before. What is that?
That's what they call it these days.
It's called a Lysine love goddess. Hey, hand me the LLG here.
But no, I could see her having one of those, like, little nude statuettes or something, like decorating her room, and then they think she worships it, and she doesn't even worship it. She just likes it or something.
Yeah, it might not. Yeah, we do see her praying at another point, but it's just like she's whispering a prayer to herself. Like, you can't really glean anything from it. So
even if she did worship it and it was more innocent, it was love between mother, daughter, or something like that, it's still not one of the seven. You can still, why it would be like a
exactly
hot topic, this outsider, weird religion,
Right. Yeah, it's again, so that's why I'm putting in this section about prejudice. Like, oh, this weird foreign god she's worshiping. It's like, well, what if this god might be like a good suggestion, like what this god stands for might be kind of a positive thing, but it's not the seven, so no. And that just makes her all the more reason to gossip about her. So they have all these things to gossip about: how she's Dornish, how she's a paramour, what her past is, how she worships these strange gods. Just so many things to gossip about. And that's why, again, it just comes back to, you got to be tough. You got to be tough-minded to be the object of all this gossip at court, where people aren't too shy about. They're not going to like make sure you don't hear. They kind of will inflict it on you willingly. Like, intentionally let you hear, like whisper loudly, like that kind of thing. They're not keeping it under wraps. Like, you have Olenna calling her the serpent's whore and things like that. This is not, this isn't super subtle here. So, and again, Sansa's especially someone who's very young, hasn't learned that, everything isn't just what you've been taught, or just people worship other gods in this world, Sansa. It's not that strange. Shay too, it's not that strange. It doesn't mean bad things. But she's a young teenager and is very sheltered still. Her naivete is only starting to come off at this point. So it's very possible, though. Like Nina says, yeah, it's absolutely possible this is true. Maybe it's not Lysine. Maybe it's just some other foreign god that they just misidentified. But either way, like, it's not weird. It's not abnormal. It's not scandalous. But it is interesting, and it causes other people to see it that way. And it might be just like the fear thing, might be like the reputation thing. Maybe she wants people to think she worships weird love gods or goddesses or what have you, and to enhance her reputation. She's supposed to be this polarizing figure at court that's supposed to rub people the wrong way. So maybe lean into it a little more. Maybe spread these rumors. Maybe like, yeah. Ellaria does worship a strange Lysine love goddess. They want people to think that. It's entirely possible this was part of their play, part of their overall strategy to stand out at court before things took a dramatic right turn. So there's a lot of different things there. And in that one scene, just Shay making this like 3 sentences and Sansa's thought, just in it, there's so much wrapped into it. It's another testament to how deep George's world building is, that we can glean so much from that without reaching. I mean, I don't think any of those things are reaches, because they reflect real world values and real world concepts in ways that we're very familiar with. I keep coming back to the attractiveness thing, like how Sansa's like, but I kind of like how she looks, but given what I'm taught, this isn't beautiful, but it kind of is. Like, it's super interesting to me that she's wrestling with that. A girl at her age, like, hasn't been taught what beautiful is, but she should be able to do what she wants and be like, well, I get to decide what I want looks good on me, not what other people think, And Ellaria, she's kind of confronted with that by someone that has that freedom, and it's like, it's puzzling to her. She doesn't hate it, which is a credit to her, that she's not like turned off by it or prejudiced too much, but she's just confused by it, right? Because she doesn't exactly agree with Shay when Shay's like, oh, this, and she just kind of like, okay, well, you told me that. She's not like, oh yeah, oh, how awful. Yeah, she's just kind of like listening and taking it in and pondering it,
It is. I have, this is like maybe a slightly awkward story, but my granddad, you can imagine, past generations had much greater levels of racism than we have now. I think we're growing and learning. And And he had a neighbor who was a black guy, and he would point out, he's a good guy for a black guy. Like, he needed to put that caveat in. He still had it in him that black people aren't really good, but this one is different. You know, it's similar to how Sansa is like, well, Dornish people aren't really beautiful, but she is beautiful. It's like she's having to reconcile this ingrained racism or prejudice that's in her with this reality that she's facing. You know?
Yeah, because it's not actually true to her, or it isn't true to everybody. It's like, no, I find her pretty beautiful, actually. Why does this not fit with what I've been taught? Well, it's because beauty standards are crap. I mean, not entirely crap, but they're not meant to be rules. They're meant to be, at best, they're meant to be guidelines at best. You know, you're supposed to ultimately, do your own thing and or whatever makes you comfortable, which might mean going with the standards. That's valid to choose. But Sansa was never taught that was an option. She's just taught that there's the one way. All right, let's take a quick break for roughly the middle, answer some questions, do a few shout outs, and we'll get back to the Purple Wedding, Tyrion's trial, the actual duel, and what comes after, including our predictions for what might happen to Ellaria by the end. Sean, tell us who you have for us this week to give fun shout outs to.
Well, I've been bouncing back and forth between the oldest and newest patrons, but I want to give a shout out to someone who's been with our last couple patron calls. Let me say this. This is a long one. Lord Giuliano of House U, Hand of Queen Ashea, known as the Omni Knight.
I like the Omni Knight as a title quite a bit. It both sounds like a rainbow because it's all the colors, but also it can have a lot of other connotations like just multifaceted or jack of all trades.
You know what it makes me think of?
What?
Aziz and I play this game called Fire Emblem, and sometimes you have like certain units that like very versatile. They like can use an axe and a lance and a sword, and I call them like my Swiss Army knife.
Swiss Army Knight.
I mean, that's what I meant to say.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
I call them my Swiss Army Knight, but which they are basically like the Omni Knight.
That's pretty good. Yeah. And as a hand of the queen or king, you would want someone who's got a broad skill set, I would think. So that fits.
So we've still got some others to list off real quick here. Willard the Slumbery of Goat's Tree. Flash the Leather.
Slumbery. Love it.
Yeah. Lady Priscilla of the White Spear.
Nice.
Master Minotaur of House Gardner. Our grass is always greener.
Nice.
And Lyanna Snow, the Raven in Winter.
Ooh, that one touches on a lot of bases there. Cool. Yeah, you can get your own patron name by joining us at patreon.com/history of Westeros. We've been, over the last year plus, we've been making lots of changes to our Patreon page, adding more bonus episodes, adding some simplicity to the navigation, and just trying to make it all better all around, make it more worthwhile. So go there if you're interested in joining and getting access to our bonus content. We really appreciate it. And soon we're going to have a lot of voting on a lot of episodes. We want to try to get really far ahead. So we're going to have what's I can roughly call a topics moot, where we pick a lot of topics in a relatively short time. I haven't quite worked out how we're going to do it yet. We've been kind of talking about it on our in our meetings. So you're going to want to sign up to be a part of that and get all the other things that come with being a member as well.
Just be careful not to mix up the topic moot with the topic mute. I don't want to mix those up.
Dornish Dame says, this has me in mind of Lara Rogare and the prejudice she faced for not worshiping the Seven, which, of course, came right after the Dance of the Dragons. And we've talked about that a bit, and a couple of times we talked about during the episode on Lys. And that is also something Nina pointed out. So good call, both of you. Yes, Lara Rogare faced prejudice specifically for being Lyseni, for worshiping Lyseni gods. Now, she also didn't even learn the language. So not to say that's a good reason to be prejudiced against her, but it was just the weight of that prejudice was larger because she didn't try to become part of the Westerosi culture or was unable to. And then she never really liked it. She left, right? And including leaving her children behind. So yeah, she really didn't like it, but there's no indication that Ellaria doesn't like it. If she didn't like it, well, she wasn't showing it. She was poised and putting a brave face forward. Anders Graham makes the comment, mascar mating. Is that
like masquerading?
Masquerading.
Like
yeah.
Masquerading. Yes, Shay's masquerading. It really made me laugh.
That's good.
That is good. So, the purple wedding and Tyrion's trial. Cersei solves the seating issue actually pretty cleverly. Cersei is clever. She's somehow that amazing mix of stupid and clever. She's both. I mean, she's not stupid when she's not angry, but she's just angry so often.
I think that she's intelligent but unwise.
Yeah, that too. And prone to acting when she's angry, which is part of being unwise.
Which is unwise, yeah.
Yeah. So that makes it that snowballs really, really badly. So this case, she solved it pretty smoothly. She just put another table in and put it right below the dais. So it's very much a place of honor, but it's also very far from the Tyrells. Tyrion notes that it's as far from the Tyrells as possible. So it's actually pretty smoothly done by Cersei there.
And it makes sense to put all the Dornish at that one table. So you don't have to have the high Dornish with Ellaria up with the other high nobles. So it's something that makes sense. And it's hard to argue against and so on. Yeah.
Yeah. Now, so she's there at the purple wedding, of course, like so many others. She isn't really noted during the event, except for that we definitely see her. But she's not really a part of course, the scene of Joffrey and Tyrion and Joffrey dying eventually. But the other things that precede that, the scene they were making and Joffrey dumping his wine on Tyrion and all that stuff. So it's the scene is through Tyrion's point of view. So is it through Sansa's? Yeah. Anyway, I always forget, but it doesn't matter. Neither of them take much note of Ellaria, but she's there for sure. So she sees Joffrey die. She sees Joffrey behave too, and it's like, whoa, that guy's going to be the king. They must have heard things, but seeing him behave that way in front of a bunch of people, probably for the first time, is like, whoa, dang, that's bad. But she may have sympathized with Cersei throughout, despite everything, because as a mother, seeing another mother lose their child right in front of them is like, well, even as much as I support my husband's revenge, this is rough. Like, I didn't need to see that, but maybe she relished in it. We really don't know. She might've been like, yeah, that kid deserved it. I don't want to go too far in what I assume about Ellaria, especially because one of my theories is that she may have done an about face after Oberyn's death and realized that may have been what set her on this anti-blood feud cycle. Before she may have been like, yeah, revenge, good, yeah, get him.
I wonder if it may not have been a full about face if she was already starting to turn after seeing Joffrey die in Cersei's arms.
Maybe that started it. Maybe that added some weight to what came shortly after.
She starts to think about where this is going, and she might have one of her kids dying in her arms, and
exactly,
et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, like she might have cared about the cycle of violence, cared about getting revenge, but she cares about her own children more than that. Like, well, if it was one or the other, then there's no choice at all. I'm picking my children and peace over getting revenge. So yeah, you're right. You're right to point that out, that she may have pictured herself in that spot, and she could easily see that future given the violence between these families and the stakes in play and the personalities in play. People like Cersei and her paramour Oberyn and Gregor Clegane and Tywin Lannister. These are ruthless, brutal, violent people. So it's not hard for her to imagine that could have some blowback on her family.
And, Oberyn wasn't necessarily there to specifically kill Joffrey. But if Oberyn had his way, if he could snap his finger and have every Lannister die, he would probably do it, right?
Oh, yeah. Mm-hmm.
And that's exactly why Elia and her kids are dead, right?
Yes.
And so she sees this is the same thing. if there's any piece of logic going through her brain, that's the path that this is headed on, that someone wants to kill her kids. She'd rather just stop this whole thing.
Their rank didn't save them. Like, Elia was basically the heir to being queen of Westeros, and it didn't stop her. It didn't save her. Even though like normal hostage situation, normal like nobles are protected and given for ransom, didn't protect her. It just goes to show that you can't count on those things. So Oberyn visits Tyrion in his cell, and before he offers to be his champion in public, he does it there in private. Recall. He mentions the possibility as well of marrying Cersei, because remember, Tywin was floating that idea as a way to sort of stitch things back up. It's like, you could marry Oberyn, or you could marry Balon Greyjoy. And she's like, what? Are you kidding me? And Jaime, when he hears, is like, are you kidding me? It's the same similar reaction. Like, what the hell? And politically, it kind of makes sense, but it's like, what the? How can these marriages will be dysfunctional as all hell? And so he brings it up as like, Ellaria thinks we should say yes because she wants her in our bed. She's never had a blonde royal before, or whatever it is he says. It's like she's randy just thinking about it, and but then Oberyn pivots to the Corgyle Scorpion bed murder story, which he would know very well considering he was fostered there, right? And it's also just a famous story that's come up many times on our show. He says, I'd rather have those scorpions in my bed than Cersei. So he's not dumb.
I don't know. I differ with Oberyn in many ways. And this is
yeah, I would also rather have. So I'd take the Cersei risk than the 100 scorpions. Yeah. So at the trial when it came around, did Ellaria already know this? Like, she was presumably there in the crowd, though we don't see it. She was definitely there for the duel, obviously, but for the actual trial, I don't know if she was there. Probably though, because her, Oberyn's there as a judge. She's a dignitary at court. It's a big event. She probably was there. So, but did she know what he was going to do? Did she know he was going to stand up and go, I'm quite convinced I will stand for Tyrion as his champion? And everybody's like, what? It goes crazy. The room explodes. Was she like waiting for that moment? Like, I can't wait for this. Like, I'm going to see the explosion. She's like sitting there savoring the moment. And or she was just excited to see how it all played out. I don't know, but she might not have known. She might not have seen it coming. He might not have told her.
I don't think she did, because I'm not sure Oberyn knew. I'm not sure how certain he was that he was going to make that play, much less had he talked about it to her. I can imagine maybe they had had a discussion, but not, I have decided this. I think it's something he was batting around in his own head. I don't think he knew it well enough to have told her he was going to do it.
Okay. Yeah, because he maybe he wasn't sure what was actually going to happen, although he had already told Tyrion he was going to do it. So I wonder, maybe it's possible she even was part of the planning, like gave him some of the ideas. Yeah. Like he bounces ideas off her. We have no idea what that part of their relationship was like. So I just don't know. I'm guessing probably not to that level of like, you should poison your spear, and all that stuff. I'm not sure. I don't think she had that level of involvement, but it is possible. We can't throw that out, right?
I think if she had seen Gregor ahead of time, she would have told him to poison his spear.
Well, yeah, because she definitely hadn't seen him ahead of time. Because when
she seemed surprised,
yeah, she's like, "You're gonna fight that," and he goes, "I'm gonna kill that." So clearly, she hadn't seen him yet, which makes sense because Cersei, when they say, "I'll stand as champion," Cersei says, "Gregor has returned to the city, a day or 2 days ago." So it was very recently he has come back. So it makes sense that she wouldn't have seen him yet.
This reminds me of another thing, too, that might have shifted Ellaria's stance. Having gone to King's Landing and seen the resources at the Lannisters' disposal, she might have dreaded how the war's going to go. Right?
Yeah, maybe.
Oberyn took out Gregor, but they might have another Gregor. They've just got knights and horses and money and people and everything all around. Like we just don't have these resources back in Dorne. I don't know if we can stand up. I mean, maybe we can. We stood up to the dragons, but how many people died standing up to the dragons? Mm-hmm. I don't want my daughters to die. I don't want this to happen.
Yeah, well said. Now, also during the duel, she says, because she's right next to Tyrion, they're next to each other. Obviously, they both have a lot in play on that duel. She says Oberyn is toying with him at one point, and Tyrion's like, "That's a very stupid thing to do." but he wants
on your own time. My life's at stake here.
It's not really. He wasn't really toying with him. He was trying to frustrate him and get him to yell, to admit his guilt through that. For that frustration was a setup to make him admit his guilt. It's like, say her name over and over, and getting in his head and all that, and wounding him and making him tired, and just until he just loses it entirely. But
he was partly toying with him because there is sort of a psychological advantage, and he does need to wear him down. But also, he could have just killed him. He got to a point where he could have just killed him. He didn't, because he wasn't trying to save Tyrion's life. He's trying to get this admission of guilt.
Yeah, he didn't give a crap
And,
about Tyrion.
Yeah.
He did not care. He's like, yeah, I'll save you. But he's more about like another thumb in Tywin's eye to save Tyrion. He's like, oh, I can kill Gregor and piss off Tywin like in a separate way. Like it's already going to piss off Tywin, but this is a double whammy. Yeah. So it fell into place so well, except for the whole
Except that it didn't.
dying part. Yeah. So the focus is, of course, on Tyrion's reaction. Obviously, it's his POV, and he's very much concerned for his own life. But as he's throwing up his breakfast when Oberyn's skull is crushed, Ellaria's wail of terror, is in his. He notes it as he's, condemned, because they're right there. So, as unique as her place at court was in the short time she was there, Oberyn's death is arguably even more compelling in terms of what it does to her character. Partly that's just because we don't know what's coming. There's, the mystery is always a bit more compelling in some ways. There's always the allure of the unknown. I mean, George wrote the Red Viper to be killed, as we said. He just did it so well. He outwrote himself. The reason that he cites, and there's other reasons, of course, but one of the loudest reasons that George cites for the 5-year gap being scrapped is the reaction to the Red Viper's death. He's like, I wrote this character to be dead, but I did it so well that I can't skip the reaction to it. I can't do it in retrospect only. Oops, made this character too interesting. It's like the Boba Fett effect of like, this character wasn't supposed to be important, but everyone loves him so much. We can't. George fell for that himself. It's like if Spielberg had decided that about Boba Fett. He's like, you know what? Boba Fett's too cool. I got to expand his role. It doesn't matter what the fans say. It's cool that the fans agree, but I'm the one that thinks Boba Fett is cool, so I'm doing this. It's the same thing as George is like, man, this Red Viper is just, he's too cool. He didn't climb back out of the Sarlacc pit cool, but you can't really come back from that. Crushed skull, that's not very ambiguous. But so anyway, the political shift is gigantic. Dorne's reaction is gigantic, but the most personally impacted is her. If anyone alive knows his secrets, knew the man truly behind the poison spear, behind the threats, behind the anger, it would be her, even more than Doran, I think. And I don't think Doran's going to be alive all that much longer anyway, so it won't even be a question probably in a little while. So she obviously doesn't stay at King's Landing very long because she has to bring home Oberyn's body. Much grieving from her along the way, to be sure, and trepidation. She probably, in the back of her mind, knows that, oh boy, lots going to happen now. His death is going to be, there's going to be a big provocation. She knows her countrymen. She knows they're going to react strongly. She knows they're not just going to take it lying down. So it's another double whammy that she lost her lover, the only person in the world that meant this much to her other than her children, which is a different sort of love, obviously. And she fears for her country now. This all backfired so badly, and the outcry is going to be so severe that it will probably, if not certainly, lead to more violence. So I just can only imagine. I don't want to linger on it because it's not a very pleasant thought, like what's going through her mind. It's a procession back to Dorne. It probably wasn't like a brisk trot. They move slowly, probably, and that's how mourners work, right? Usually just go kind of nice, easy pace, and people follow along and express their grief. You go, that's kind of the point. So she's the one to bring him back to Sun Spirits. It's actually Gregor's body that causes arguably even more of a stir in Dorne in some ways, less in some ways, more in others. So yeah, let's talk about that. What I've called this section is the skull and the speech. Sir Balon Swan arrives with the skull claimed to belong to Sir Gregor, and a feast is held, which we see through the eyes, not of that skull, but of Areo Hotah via, it would be weird though if we saw it through the skull. In the Watcher chapter, Doran commands that the box containing the skull be opened, and Maester Caliot brings it from Sir Balon to him. Arianne is sitting to one side of Prince Doran, Ellaria on the other, and here's what happened next. Quote,
a hush had fallen across the hall. Dorne holds its breath. Master Caliot set the box on the floor beside Prince Doran's chair. The maester's fingers, normally so sure and deft, turned clumsy as he worked the latch and opened the lid to reveal the skull within. Hotah heard someone clear his throat. One of the Fowler twins whispered something to the other. Ellaria Sand had closed her eyes and was murmuring a prayer.
I wonder what she's praying for. It might be to that Lysine love goddess, but might not be. It might just be like, I hope this doesn't, may he be at rest. May this help put him at rest. May this not provoke more violence. I don't know, but there's a lot of things. It's not hard to think that there's plenty of things that would be on her mind that would she want to pray for. But
yeah, I think she's praying that this will be the end. Okay, you got Gregor's head. Now we're done. That's what everyone wanted, right? We got it, right? That's
and Tywin is dead by then too. That's important as well.
Yeah.
Like Tywin was killed by Tyrion in the most
Yeah.
embarrassing, ignoble way, like after the result of that duel. So it's all kind of connected to that. So some people might even like give partial credit to the Red Viper for stirring that scene of the series of events that led to Tyrion killing Tywin, so they could give him a little bit of a point for that. So, but also her daughters are now fatherless. I mean, there's just gonna be a ton of things on her mind. Maybe praying for peace, protection, anything, just emotionally devastating loss. It's not hard to think that there'd be a lot on her mind. So we don't know what it was, but there's a lot of things possibly. Now, perhaps she's praying for, like you said, Sean, for peace. And that comes up here. The thing that Doran says a few minutes later of Sir Gregor, quote,
I only pray that now he is burning in some hell and that Elia and her children are at peace. This is the justice that Dorne has hungered for. I'm glad that I lived long enough to taste it. At long last, the Lannisters have proved the truth of their boast and paid this old blood debt.
So he wants the cycle of violence to end too. He quotes at one point his unnamed mother telling him at the Water Gardens, look at these children, consider them first in all that you do. So Ellaria's probably subscribes to that way of thinking. And I wonder I wonder what conversations Doran and Ellaria had upon her return to Dorne with Oberyn's body. And if they talked about the dangers that are coming or just supported each other a bit, because Doran doesn't really include her in his plans going forward, understandably. Partly because she doesn't want to be a part of it, and partly because she has other concerns, partly because she's not ambitious or political, and partly because...
Do you think there's any chance they had a conversation off screen?
Oh, yeah. I do.
And that he knows her sentiment already at this point, that she's, a peacemonger.
Yeah, a peacemonger, yeah. So when the toast is made to King Tommen, many do not drink. Hota is very aware. He's looking around, trying to see who drinks, who doesn't. And the others don't. But Ellaria does. Ellaria drinks to peace. And she's sitting at the high table. So it's very notable that she drinks to peace. And so does Doran. Well, actually, Doran doesn't, because he doesn't drink at all. He drinks his own. He doesn't drink wine. He drinks his own. So he was like, he has an excuse to not drink, is he drinks his poppy juice separately. So... But it's still a signal of her attitude. A lot of people in the hall. She's at the high table. She's drinking very openly and toasting to peace and all that. But not everyone necessarily knows what an advocate for peace she is. I don't know if everyone in the room is aware of her position. Maybe they become aware of it later, but how outspoken had she been about this prior? We don't know. But she's still declaring it very openly through her action. And maybe she's trying to set an example, like even if the person Oberyn was closest to, or the two people Oberyn was closest to, can put this away, then maybe they should too. Most of them probably won't, but it helps probably. Might change a few people's minds.
She needs to be the one to set the example,
Yes.
Whether it works or not. If it's going to work, the hope is in her and Doran. There's no one else that can do it.
And the flip side is if she's calling for blood, she'll get it. Exactly. So just by not doing it, it makes a huge difference. Yeah. So not only does she live out this attitude, or at least she starts to, because again, we don't know when it began for her, but she provides us with possibly the best conversation on the topic of cycles of violence. Now, this comes a little later when they are looking at the skull after the event is over and they're in private. So George gives this great speech to her, this conversation. First, it starts with Obara saying, quote,
She gave the skull a mocking kiss. This is a start, I'll grant.
A start, said Ellaria Sand, incredulous. Gods forbid. I would it were a finish. Tywin Lannister is dead. So are Robert Baratheon, Amory Lorch, and now Gregor Clegane. All those who had a hand in murdering Elia and her children. Even Joffrey, who was not yet born when Elia died. I saw the boy perish with mine own eyes, clawing at his throat as he tried to draw a breath. Who else is there to kill? Do Myrcella and Tommen need to die so the shades of Rhaenys and Aegon can be at rest? Where does it end?
It ends in blood as it begins, said Lady Nym. It ends when Casterly Rock is cracked open so the sun can shine on the maggots and worms within. It ends with the utter ruin of Tywin Lannister and all his works.
The man died at the hand of his own son, Ellaria snapped back. What more could you wish?
I mean, seriously, she's so right. Like, what more? Like, it really is like a good. If this isn't a stopping point, like,
I want to point out here. I think I had it here. The next line. Her answer is, "I could wish that he died at my hand."
yeah, exactly.
It's not that they just want vengeance. They want to get vengeance. They want to be the ones that do it. It's not enough for vengeance to be done or even for them to win the battle. They want to be the ones, they being, people who were hell-bent on vengeance and not thinking about peace or the children or all the other things that should be higher priorities, that they want to get it themselves.
Or even not thinking about how it's a much sweeter vengeance again for his own son to kill him.
That was an
Like,
epic.
that is like that
epic
seems
failure.
Yeah, that seems better than you killing him. I don't know.
Yeah, I agree. Like it's like vengeance. It's like they're treating it like it was a pie they didn't get a slice of, It's like, hey, I didn't get my slice. It's like, yeah, but the pie was distributed and it was a good pie. It was a very good pie. But no. There's a wrinkle here, which is that they aren't worried about the skull ultimately because there doesn't seem to be any point to switching the heads. They talk about it. They're like, hey, is this really Gregor's skull? And they're like, what purpose would there be to fooling us about the skull? Like Gregor definitely was poisoned by the manticore venom. So there's no doubt that dude died, right? And what's the point of switching the skulls? Like, what could possibly be the point of that? Well, we know magic, maybe necromancy or something that might be involved, but they can't conceive of that possibility. So they're like, yeah, it's just, it might not be his skull, but why would she do that? And yeah, they because there's no good answer, they kind of leave it at that. But we do know that it's probably not Gregor's skull. And so that will be upsetting again later. That'll come back up later when the two of the Sand Snakes go to King's Landing and are like, all right, who's the 8-footer? Like, wait,
the other 8-footer?
Yeah. On the
I did
guard,
say that. Yeah. I did speculate that Ellaria might have wondered, do they have another Gregor? What are they going to come at us with? Even if somehow we fight them off, it's not worth it.
Yeah, what is her reaction going to be? Because she will find out eventually that actually this dude's walking around. Like, she's like, what's she going to make of that? She's like, how is that? Like, what? A lot of people are going to be confused over that. It's pretty confusing.
And that's all the more reason to make peace. Like, even when we kill their giant warrior, they still have the giant warrior
as a walking zombie. Yeah, that's maybe we shouldn't be messing with them. They might be above our weight class there. So there is another paragraph that Ellaria says after the exchange of, I want it to be me. I didn't get any vengeance personally. So the conclusion of her plea to, remember, these are her paramour's 3 eldest children. Remember, Sorella's not there, and Sorella's the 4th, and she's off at Old Town being Alaris, the Sphinx. So they seem dead set on their path. This is her final plea to get them to stop. Quote,
Oberyn wanted vengeance for Elia. Now the 3 of you want vengeance for him. I have 4 daughters, I remind you, your sisters. My Elia is 14, almost a woman. Obella is 12, on the brink of maidenhood. They worship you, as Dorea and Loreza worship them. If you should die, must Elia and Obella seek vengeance for you? Then Dorea and Loreza for them? Is that how it goes, round and round forever? I ask again, where does it end? I saw your father die. Here is his killer. Can I take a skull to bed with me to give me comfort in the night? Will it make me laugh, write me songs, care for me when I'm old and sick?
There should be like a pamphlet distributed to all of Westeros. Like, right? Like, just get Ellaria Sand, the screed of someone who knows, right? Like, a lot of people should be taught this. Maybe in the real world too. Like, a lot of people could take a lesson from that. So then she pretty much walks out after that. She's like, I'm done. You all aren't listening. I can't hear this bloodthirstiness anymore. I'm done. And then Nim immediately declares after Ellaria leaves, she's like, oh, our father she loved our father and he loved her, but she didn't understand him. Oh, come on. That's like one of the most naive things I've ever heard. Like, you're telling me that your father's 15-year plus partner, like they've been together that long and didn't understand him?
That's what she thought of her stepmom, obviously.
Yeah.
Not unusual, I think, for a daughter like
That's
that
true.
to be like, I know my dad and you don't know my dad.
That's a good point. That's a very good point. Yes, the stepmom kind of thing, or not stepmom.
It's not like that. They're not married,
yeah.
but like, I still don't think it's like, it's childish. It's not mature. Like, you're right to point it out that it's wrong, but I think it's accurate to the human experience.
You're right. Yeah, you're right to point out that rub. I didn't take note of that. You're totally right to point that out. That is a thing. And Doran then looks at her like, are you nuts? He doesn't say that, but he's like, kind of corrects her. He's like, a good heart and a gentle mind, that may be all that may be worth more than this, blah, blah, blah. He's like, you should reconsider what you just said. Basically, he puts it diplomatically, but he like gives her a look like.
It is worth noting, she wants revenge. Oberyn wanted revenge. Like, there's a difference between understanding and agreeing, but that's where she's coming from. And Doran, even though he's kind of, I don't know, putting her in check, he has ulterior motives. He also wants peace and doesn't want this revenge thing to take hold. So he's not going to say, you're right, Oberyn did want revenge. He's not going to give that admission.
Yeah. He's like, actually, I'm going to have to side with the Sand Snakes on this one, Ellaria. So, but he did raise them to be fighters, the older ones. I mean, and including Elia, who, and Obella as well. Is like, Obella swings her morning star at orange trees and stuff. We're told it's kind of cute, but also like a little bit, like shows how they were educated. And Nina writes, this is it's a reflective of how, you can have two people who really love someone, that are really deeply in someone's life, and they have very different views on them. It's also very human, right? Like Ashea was correct to bring up the thing about other, stepmoms, or the equivalent in this case. This is a thing, right? You have people that think they know someone really well, but have never seen this other side of them, because that side only comes out with these other individuals or people they have a different type of relationship with, which is why we can't be sure Oberyn included Ellaria in some of his like most violent plottings, or some of his stuff. Doesn't mean she didn't. We just don't assume it, right? Now, Nina also makes a nice comparison here with Ned. Robb and Catelyn both clearly loved him. They reacted to his death very differently. Like, Catelyn still was Ellaria-ish here. Like, she at first was more about being aggressive, but then, as this war started to get going, she was like, wait, this is too far. This isn't what I wanted. We want peace, actually, but that ship had sailed already by then. So this is this makes a good parallel to Ellaria, especially if we're right that Ellaria had a bit of an about face after Oberyn's death, and was like, oh, I wasn't such an advocate for peace before. Now I am, that I've seen both sides of it. After I've seen Joffrey dying in front of me and my paramour dying in front of me. Catelyn may have been more gung-ho about getting revenge and justice for Bran, until she saw like, oh, the Riverlands was annihilated, and there's all this stuff is happening. Like, maybe it's just better if we just try to find peace now. Like, this is too much. This has gone too far. But of course, it's not her fault, but it was also too late.
Also, to make the parallel more, Catelyn's realizing that her children are at risk because of this, right? Yeah. Like, I lost my husband. That sucks. It's terrible. I want revenge. In order to get revenge, now I am going to lose my children also. Okay, never mind. I don't want revenge. I'd rather have my children than revenge.
Yes. Yeah. When she realized that, I mean, she may have had some of his cockiness, or maybe she had it on her own too, and they fueled each other with that. And then reality check, comes along. So we can wonder what she would think if she knew Doran had them swear to follow his plans, meaning the Sand Snakes, on their father's bones. Because as much as he openly advocates for peace in that scene where the skull is presented, he can't actually do that yet because he finds out that Cersei's planning to murder Trystane. Like, it's definitely not over yet. Like, they can't just rest and sit back and be like, we're not part of this. Not only is Quentin over there trying to like get Dany on their team, which obviously that didn't work, but it's not necessarily the end of the potential between a Dornish Daenerys alliance. Regardless, that's a much later thing. Either way, he can't just take a step back and be like, we're not involved, because Cersei is aggressively coming after them. So he doesn't tell Ellaria any of this. Like, when Ellaria leaves the room because of the bloodthirstiness that she's just done with hearing about, that's when he pivots to like, okay, well, Ellaria is right about some things, but I'm not telling her about this part. There's no reason to include her in any of this news. She's seen enough. She's been affected enough, but this is what's happening. Cersei wants to kill Trystane. And they're like, what? They're so shocked. And Arya Hota is like, I wouldn't have thought it possible to shock the Sand Snakes, but here we are, And of course, what's happening for that is let's review the plans. The two of them are going to King's Landing, right? And then Obara is going to High Hermitage with Arya Hota. Whatever happens, Ellaria is going to find out, right? Whatever happens at High Hermitage, whatever happens in King's Landing, whatever else happens in in Sunspear, news will reach the Hellholt. They're connected. They're an important house in Dorne, and Harmon Uller wants to be a part of things. And the reason that's important is that's where she went. She went back to the Hellholt. She is there now, as far as we know, with one of her daughters, only one of them, Lareza, who is the youngest, 7 years old. So, in terms of outlook, I think she's a rare character where I feel pretty optimistic about her survival. Because she's not obviously involved, because she's very far from the others, because she's not likely to make an enemy of any dragons or Dothraki or young Griff's team. The Golden Company probably isn't going to go anywhere near the Hellholt, right? Like,
yeah, she's not really in harm's way.
Yeah.
She's not in harm's way. She doesn't put herself in harm's way.
Right.
Hellholt is probably not a target for anyone. So,
like, he may lead their forces elsewhere, but she won't go with them. She'd stay there, right? She's, again, not a warrior. There's no reason for her to go with. It's not like she's rooted there permanently. There might be a reason for her to leave. There could be a reason for her to go somewhere else. But there's no obvious, oh, this will draw her out. This thing that's coming will happen, and that'll bring her out. But no, there's just nothing that's that clear. So her daughter, Lareza, also because she's with her and is so young, I'm pretty optimistic about her, too. Real quick, here's a good chance to drop the Lareza name theory, which is that, okay, consider the four names of
my favorite thing to talk about.
Yeah, I think this would perk you up a little bit. Illaria's first three daughters are Elia, Obella, and Dorea. Presumably, Elia is named for Elia, the sister. Obella is named for Oberyn, and Dorea for Doran. So there's one daughter for each of the three the three of them, the three siblings, that group. So one for each of them. So if they were to name their next child after another family member, the most likely one is their mother, who was the Princess of Dorne. She wasn't their father was the consort, so he was not Martell, and she was. So she's the most likely, especially because it's a girl to a woman, but also because she was the actual princess. So to be fair, we don't know their father's name or house either. But obviously the Princess of Dorne is a much more important figure. So it's a bummer we don't know who that was. But Lareza is a great guess for her name. And who came up with that theory, Shea?
I've been seeing it from like people like Joanna Lannister and folks in Tumblr circles for as long as I've been in this fandom, to be honest, because we have a long-standing conversations about the unnamed Princess of Dorne and about the Dead Ladies Club and about all that. And yeah, people, I believe I'll attribute it. I think it was Joanna Lannister. I think that's
kind of what I thought too, but I wasn't positive.
I believe that was where I first saw it, because her and I, like, we've both asked George this question at panels, at Q&As. I asked him, and he gave me one of the most disappointing answers I've ever gotten, which is, well, she's dead. Promptly right after he read a whole section about dead characters. So, okay. But Joanna, Lauren, she did not take that for an answer either, and we went to another Q&A a few years later, and we were in like Redwood City in California, and that's when I asked about Bloodraven. But she asked specifically about the Loreza theory. Like she used that theory. She's like, I'm gonna come at it from a different angle. I'm gonna give him the theory, and he can choose
He
to
can seize on that if he.
And he just was like, I don't know.
Yeah,
he just didn't know.
I propose that the name of B, if not Loreza, Lauren. Because it's like Loreza and it's their theory. Or Ashea. Why not Ashea? That could be a Dornish name.
But no, I do like it. Some lore something, whether it's Loreza, because the other ones are tweaked as well.
Loreza Ashea. One word. So Loreza 7 is Loreza 7, like I said, with Ellaria at the Hellhole. Dorea is age 8, and she's at the Water Gardens. I'm a little more nervous about her because I'm a little wary of what might happen at the Water Gardens later. I mean, she's an 8-year-old child, so it's not as likely that harm will come to her. But this is that's not something you would want to bet on too much in this story.
Can I point out how grim it is that when we consider the outlook of characters, that the default question is, will they live or not?
Yeah.
Even when we're talking about children.
8-year-olds swimming in the pools. Yeah. She might not make it.
What's their outlook? Probably death. Yeah.
Yeah. It doesn't look great for her. No, she's probably going to be okay, but I do worry a little bit because we gave a theory about the Water Gardens. It's not a super strong theory. It's more of a headcanon, like things that line up. Seems a little ominous. But we lay that out in Nymeria Part 1, the Mother Royne episode, some comparisons to some things that got destroyed and the Water Gardens. So it might just be a reach there, but I hope it is. I hope it's a theory that's wrong, but it is. I will at least be able to claim credit for it if we're right. We're like, well, either we're wrong and this 8-year-old girl survives, or she doesn't, and we at least get to be right about our theory. Like Obella, who is age 12, is now cupbearer to the Castellan's wife at Sunspear. The Castellan is a Martell, Manfrey Martell. He's very old. He's so old that he's like, I think he might be blind. Oh, no, that's the Seneschal, Ricasso. But Manfrey Martell is an older man. Anyway, I'm concerned about anyone in Sunspear. Like Sunspear, stuff could happen there. But still, I'm not super worried about it because I really don't think armies are coming to Dorne. And if they do, it'll be Dany. And I don't think Dany's going to be like shredding the Dornish up, like ripping them apart. You know what I mean? Especially not children. So I'm not too worried about that. But there is, you got to acknowledge the potential danger there. And she, like it said in that quote from Ellaria, Obella and Elia worship Obara, Nymeria, and Tyene, their eldest. Which she doesn't mention Sorella in that. Like, do they not worship Sorella? Maybe not. They just not know her. Sorella's kind of been always off doing her own thing, and they just don't know her very well. They might like her quite a bit if they knew her better, but yeah.
Can I also say we're talking about the naming thing?
Yeah.
I always love that Oberyn named 2 daughters after himself. Loved himself the most of all.
Obara and Obella.
Yeah, he has Obara and Obella. He's like,
It's true. You gotta like that. Yeah, he's 2 for me, 1 for you. Yeah. So when I'm not sure about the Sorella thing there, that's kind of a funny omission. Like, again, Sorella just not included there. But no, it's just because she's her own person. She's a good example of someone who's independent. Like, Sorella does her own thing. She's not wrapped up in these politics. Yeah, she wants to be a maester. Well, she's kind of following in her footsteps, her father's footsteps a bit by doing that. But yeah, because Oberyn went to the Citadel too. So again, Elia is with Arianne, a notable part of her 2 Winds of Winter chapters so far, which we've covered both individual episodes for. And Elia has major Lyanna vibes, major Lyanna Stark vibes, like down to being good with horses, down to being wild and aggressive, down to being promiscuous, flirty, all that. Well, actually, I don't know Lyanna was promiscuous, but she was probably not like shy about sexual matters. So, and then there's this. So being compared to Lyanna is not a good thing as far as your outlook for survival. that's a tragic figure, right? Like, but there's also this ominous moment in the caves where it's like, where you can't do that. You can't just go off like that. You could die. And it echoes. And it's like, whoa, that's not subtle, is it? So wait, who are you talking about? Is that she? Wait, who's gonna die? All of you, or just one? Or no, I don't know. But it's I would say it's hard to imagine all of Ellaria's children surviving. And if you had to pick one that might die, it's going to be this one. Elia is with Arianne, who herself is... Arianne's survival also is very much in doubt. So the
characters that do put themselves in harm's way.
Yes,
right.
Very much in harm's way, and could be going headlong into the arms of young Griff, Aegon the Sixth, which that won't end well, I don't think. So it's hard to imagine all of Ellaria's kids living, but hey, we could be wrong. It'd be great. It'd be a nice little nugget of happiness at the end of the story if you had some characters you could look at and go, you know what, they came out all right. She's already been heavily traumatized, so she doesn't need any more. So it's not like she's gonna come out that great. She's already lost her lover, but it doesn't have to get too much worse for her. So so fairly positive outlook going forward, even if she still has to live with what's happened so far. And of course, Doran is going to go through a lot before it's all said and done. Let's talk really briefly about the TV show. Obviously, it was very different, just to acknowledge this, because there's not as much to say because it was so different, of characters who were included on the show, but changed as opposed to cut entirely. So I'm not counting Stoneheart, which is kind of a gray area because Catelyn was included, but I'm not counting like Arianne or Victarion. So characters who were included, she's probably, if not possibly, if not definitely, the most changed, the most opposite from her book character. In some ways, it's a very simple change. Just make her the exact opposite, other than like her gender. She's still a woman, but like everything else is the opposite. Like she's instead of an outspoken advocate for peace, she becomes a person so bent on revenge that she's willing to murder her lover's brother. Like she's willing to murder Doran, because just in her quest to get revenge for Oberyn. It's like, and to talk her daughters into it. Not that they needed much convincing, but also those aren't her daughters in the book. Those are the elder Sand Snakes are her daughters in the show, but they aren't in the book. So that's a pretty huge change as well.
Like you're saying, though, if we're looking at this for potential clues, will some other character who is hell-bent on revenge be willing to murder Doran? Is that something
that's entirely possible?
Could come about? Yeah.
We've theorized that will be Darkstar, who is not in the show, and the person that is already sort of leading leading Dorne into war and going against the Prince of Dorne's wishes. So he might be, maybe he somehow wins against Hotah and Obara, maybe even brings Obara onto his side somehow. And then they go after Doran. So that could happen. Yeah, something like that could happen. It just won't involve Ellaria, quite obviously.
Yeah.
And and the ending that Ellaria and was it Nymeria? Which of the daughters died in prison with her? It doesn't matter. One of them died. The two die together in prison there, and Ellaria has to see her daughter die and then sit there with her corpse forever. It's possible that's maybe what happens to the two Sand Snakes that are going to, like, maybe Nymeria and Tyene, who are going to King's Landing. Maybe something like that happens to them while they're up there. So that could happen. It just won't be Ellaria. It'll be one of them instead. So just like I don't expect all of Ellaria's 4 daughters to survive, although I wouldn't be surprised if 3 of them did. Obara, Nymeria, Tyene, Sorella, all 4 of them surviving seems very unlikely. Sorella's probably got the best odds because she's the least involved in violent stuff, but she's also right where Euron's about to strike. So that's just not necessarily in a great place either. She's not seeking danger out, at least. So maybe that gives her a little leg up, but it's all going to come down to the whim of the creator. Meaning George R. Martin. Maybe not the whim, the decisions.
I was going to say, I hesitate to call it a whim. It seems like a very deliberate.
Yeah. Planned and plotted out. Yes, it's not the whim. It could be a whim, but it probably won't be. Yeah, so it is possible some of those TV arcs are simplified versions of what they got from George, different character, like I said, Darkstar doing what the vindictive version of Ellaria is doing, just the law of conservation of characters. But that's got nothing to do with book Ellaria directly. It's possible as well that something changes, or we find it was something we haven't thought of. They get brought up in a couple of weeks. We're going to cover an episode. We're going to do an episode on some of George's notes that have been unearthed, and that is actually going to touch on some of this stuff, which is interesting. So hold some of some of y'all may have some unaddressed thoughts that we may address in that, which includes some of the theories and things that are going on here. Also, I want to, as we make our way out of this episode, I want to shout out Indira Varma, the actress who played Ellaria Sand, even though she was not what we wanted from that character, given she was so much different from the book version. It's almost like it's really hard to see a character that is so different and unique as an advocate for peace being turned into the opposite of that, because you want that to be present in the story. We want the peace advocate is such an important thing in a story about the horrors of war. I mean, that's not the only thing it's about, of course, but it's just an overwhelming theme, is that war is terrible and that all this power is terrible, and that not having that character was frustrating.
And despite that, I still picture Indira Varma as Ellaria Sand when I read scenes with her. So despite her not actually playing that character, really, I see her.
I do too. Her. Like the wail, like the scream when Oberyn dies is just like she's such a good actress. So let's go through. She is now 50 years old. She's lives in England. She was in the show Rome. She was in the show Obi-Wan. She was in the
Kenobi,
show.
I guess.
What's that?
I guess wasn't it technically called Kenobi?
Yeah, you're right. It was Kenobi, not called Obi-Wan. Yeah, you're right. It was Kenobi. It was. She was in Mission Impossible. She's in the as of current season of Doctor Who, which is season 14 as of this episode. She did voices for Dragon Age Inquisition, Mass Effect Andromeda, World of Warcraft Battle for Azeroth, and she's currently recording the Witches novels of Terry Pratchett, which are not out yet, but she's like the narrator for that, or at least playing a part of it. I'm not sure if it's like full audio production or not, but yeah, she's great. Looking forward to seeing her in more things in the future.
She's also popular. I guess maybe you didn't say it in Vox Machina. Which is not something I watch, but I know is popular among listeners of ours.
Right on,
cross section.
So yeah, so that's a really good. Like what you're saying, Ashay. Like that's a good example. That's a kind of a real testament to her skills. Like we did not like how that character was written, but she still owned the role, and she's still memorable in it. It was like, man, that plot line. Very forgettable, except her. Yeah, like some people just have they're just that good, No shade on the other actors in that plot line, especially like Alexander Siddiq, who's a fantastic actor, that's just given this role that was just kind of
God. Alexander Siddiq was one of the most popularly fan casted characters, like actors for Doran Martell. Like so many people thought that's who Doran should be, and yet. No.
What a waste. Yeah, even he's like, even he's a little salty about it afterwards. Like he's like diplomatic about it, but you can tell he doesn't want to talk about it.
Yeah.
Like people, like a few times there's like quotes in like magazines or on YouTube or little clips. It's like he's just. Yeah,
I mean,
that's what they did. They made their choices,
Yeah, think about how many people might have been in his like DMs or his comments. They're like, Doran's such a cool character. Like he has so much he's gonna do. Like he probably was influenced by the fandom to expect more too.
Yeah. So bummer, big bummer.
Remember when the show was on, I hadn't read the books yet, and up through season 4, I was excited about these Dornish characters, Oberyn and Elia.
I mean, so were we.
But when it got to season 5, I was like immediately, even though like we were trying to be positive and tactful, but I was still so frustrated by the sand snake scenes and baffled even. And I didn't have this expectation of how great it was in the books to be upsetting me. Even without that, I was still frustrated and baffled.
It was just regular.
So I can't imagine.
In my case, it was when the casting for Alexander Siddiq was announced. It was at a Comic-Con, and that was the same time they announced that there would be no Ariane Martell, because they clearly cast Trystane as the heir to Dorne. So I remember so clearly getting like, Alexander Siddiq is Doran Martell, and I was like, God is real. And then and then my next reblog is Ariane Martell was cut from the show. God is dead.
Fake. Yeah, God is dead.
As I have that as an exact time capsule of my reaction.
Okay, so the trivia answer: where did Oberyn Martell foster at? It's House Corgyle, the Castle Sandstone. Again, he tells the Scorpion story. It's nice, it fits so well there that he was fostered there. He's the one that tells the Scorpion story. It fits nicely into a little anecdote about it. He's like, I'd rather have the Scorpions than Cersei. Smoothly done, George. A good example of how well he slides in historical anecdotes, makes them fit in without it being like a big divergence from what else is happening. It just fits so nicely. Good example of that. We will, of course, be back next week. In the meantime, here are some other episodes you might want to check out. The Arianne Winds of Winter chapters are a good example. The two of those. There's very fun to talk about what's coming. Nymeria, of course, the Mother Royne episode. I'm not talking about Nymeria the Sand Snake. This is the Nymeria, aka the first princess of United Dorne. And Hardcore Houses, which was just last week. We talked about Corgyle and Uller and Umber and Mormont. Those aren't mentioned in this episode, but they're part of that one. And I probably mentioned some other ones that I'm now forgetting about because, our discussions, you never know exactly where they're going to go. We have a lot of notes. This was a 19-page document for this episode, but there's always a few things that we talk about that we didn't plan for. Sometimes that's other episodes. So I know there's always one or two that like the Lyseni episode. We talked about least quite a bit in this one. And that is also one we have an episode on. Sean, would you like to acquire a cat while we're doing our outro here?
I could do
Sean
that.
Gives
Give me a
he gave a
moment.
knowing nod for those of you not looking. He's like, yes, a cat. Oh, yeah, I've got a cat right down here. A cat of black and white, in fact. So thank you all to those of you who are supporters of us, whether you do so on Patreon, patreon.com/History of Westeros, or if you are a Spotify supporter, you can sign up directly through Spotify. If you already have a Spotify subscription, you can kind of just seamlessly combine the two things. Look at that, a cat of black and white. I will rub the belly. Mm-hmm. He has quite a bib. He's a good boy, a big boy. Thanks as well to Nina. Congrats again to Nina for her pending nuptials for her recent engagement, and as well to James, her partner. Thanks to Joey and Jesse for the music. Thanks to Bran, the builder, for being a part of our front end technology, our intro for House of the Dragon. Here's Xerxes, the cat, also on screen, and Sean's got a cat. Is that Toph? Oh, he doesn't have his headphones on, so he didn't hear me. Is that Toph? Yeah. So also thank you to Michael Klarfeld for our video intro and for the maps you see behind me, not for the posters you see behind Sean. Michael Klarfeld did not design the movie posters for either Star Wars or Amelie. So, set the record straight on that one. And thanks as well to our engineer.
But he could have.
He could have. Yeah. Sean has the skills for that. Yeah. He chose not to. Oh, look at that. Getting nose bumps there from your kitty. Well, with that little bit of sweetness, we shall leave you until next time. We hope you'd enjoyed this episode on the peaceable and respectable, I'd say, a person to be like Ellaria Sand. Rarely is there a character that I say be more like them in the story. It's hard, but she is a good example of that. Perhaps one of the top ones. So be more like Ellaria in real life, and we'll see you next time. Until then, Valar reread us.